Everyone, welcome to Spark, and as part of our summer series, today I'm going to be teaching you guys a little bit about STEM. So today we're going to be going over how to set up and perform an experiment and the important parts of it. So first and foremost, the two most important parts of an experiment are the groups and the variables. So here I have written down the two most important groups, a control group and an experimental group. So a control group is used for comparison. It's not tested on. Whereas an experimental group is tested or experimented on. And the key defining feature between a control group and experimental group is that both groups only differ by one variable. If the control group and experimental group differed by more than one variable, then you wouldn't be able to figure out the outcome of your experiment. And down there, I have an asterisk, a large sample size, because both control groups and experimental groups need large sample sizes of at least 3 variables. Without those 3 variables, you cannot have a proper experiment. So a good experiment has a control group and an experimental group, and usually only has one difference between a control group and an experimental group. Okay, so now that we know about groups and the different types of groups, let's learn about variables and how many types of variables there are. So here I have underlined the 2 most important variables, and usually scientists say that the independent variable is the most important, because without an independent variable, you cannot have dependent variables. An independent variable is changed by the experimenter or the scientist, so it could be called a manipulated variable. It's usually plotted on the x-axis and has 2 or more levels. Levels just meaning it could be the environment or the light, or if it's a plant of water that the plant is getting, because an independent variable is just changed or controlled by the experimenter. Whereas a dependent variable is a variable which changes in response to an independent variable. For instance, if the water a plant receives changes, then the plant growth would change. So dependent variable is the variable that changes because of the independent variable changing. Thus, the dependent variable is also called the responsive variable, and it's plotted on the y-axis. Great, so now we know the basics of every experiment. Well, let's go into the details of making and creating an experiment. So now that we know about groups and variables, let's discuss what a hypothesis is. So before even creating an experiment, you need to have a hypothesis, which is just an if-then statement. It's based on a defined variable, meaning that it can be tested. So it cannot be something like, oh, the universe is infinite, because that cannot be tested. A hypothesis is a statement which can be refutable and tested. Refutable means it can be debated, so it can be proven wrong or right. And in order for it to be refutable, in order for a hypothesis to be proven wrong or right, it needs to be testable. Moreover, every hypothesis is simple. It's an if-then statement, and it's very simple before it comes to the complicated parts, which are the steps of an experiment. Here I have written an example hypothesis. So it starts with if you water plants, then they will grow. So we see that this hypothesis is an if-then statement, like most hypotheses. And this is a hypothesis because it can be tested. For instance, you can have an experiment where you water plants and you don't water other plants and see which ones will grow. Therefore, it has groups and variables. Like I mentioned before, an experiment has a control group and an experimented group. So in this case, the control group would be the group of plants which have not been watered, whereas the experimental group is a group of plants which have received different amounts of water. And the variables would be the amount of water they receive, so that would be the independent variable because it is being changed and controlled by the scientist. And the dependent variable will be their growth, whether they grow, how much they grow, or if they grow at all. Okay, so that wraps up today's video on an experiment. Keep watching and keep a lookout for more STEM-related videos in this summer series. Thank you!